Hi everybody, this is Hero from the Birds back with another Shadowlands video, and in this video I'd like to take a little bit of a look at healer compositions going forward into Castle Nathria. Now healer compositions are a hot topic at this point in time because largely we have not enough data to help us to understand what healers are going to be good going into this tier, what their strengths and weaknesses are. We have some ideas and we have limited testing, but putting together a comp that's good or useful is maybe a difficult thing, especially for those of us who are not rating for the top 1%. As most of the videos that other people are putting together say, almost anything can work. I mean, you can put together 4 or 5 of any of the healers and do fine. But what I'd like to cover in this video is how we go about making any composition actually work. So it's one thing to say, hey, you can have 4 shamans and it's no problem. It's another thing to actually look at what the shamans would need to do, how they would need to orient themselves to make best use of that composition. So I'm going to have sort of 5 main things to talk about in this video that correspond with building a healer composition. The first couple have to do with the core tools of every spec, the rotational spells that they fill in, and then the damage profiles that we're going to see with Castle Nathria. And the last 2 ideas, I want to talk a little bit about how you can understand reading meters and what it might be like for us to set up a Triage Paladin setup alongside other healers. In the background, I'm going to run for you one of our Heroic Maut pulls as we were testing out our own healer comp, just in preparation for Shadowlands, and you can just see what kinds of buttons I'm pressing and what it looks like. So I'll set that on, and it'll probably run out before the end of the video, but you have a sense of something to check in on and watch the Triage Paladin at play. So the first thing I'd like to talk about is understanding the basic tools or the toolkits that each of the healers brings to the table. And I think there's a fairly useful way to break this down, maybe a triad of ideas to consider when you're thinking about building your own healer comp for Castle Nathria. Recovery, reduction, and triage. Those are the 3 basic tools that your specs will have access to. And outside of these tools, they will fill in their rotations with a bunch of other things that support them. But what do I mean by tools? I mean essentially 2 things. Abilities that convert a GCD instantaneously, so the player presses a button and something happens immediately. And also abilities that have some kind of significant impact either on HPS or the core gameplay interactions of their kit. So let's begin by talking a little bit about the idea of recovery. When I talk about recovery, I mean that single GCD you pressed translates into some kind of sustained HPS. It might be on the single target side with like life bloom for Resto Druids, which is a sort of high value button to press, not only because it's related to your kit and the generation of free regrowths, but it also has a sustained punch that you're going to throw into usually a tank. It could mean the more standard high throughput abilities we're used to seeing as raid cooldowns, Tranquility, Divine Hymn, Salvation, Healing Tide Totem. And for some of the others kits, it could be something like Healing Rain, which is a CD that you press. It breaks the mold a little bit because it's not an instantaneous, you have to cast it, but it provides sort of a lot of sustained HPS throughput. Recovery abilities are important because they allow you to convert a really short CD into a powerful effect. There is, of course, a danger of overlapping and producing significant overhealing. So if you have 2 of your classes press Divine Hymn at the same time, or you overlap Trank and Hymn together, or Healing Tide Totem, you're going to end up with a lot of wasted resources. But in general, this is the first kind of cornerstone of any healer comp, is assessing what are your major recovery tools and how can you use them effectively going forward. The second piece is what we might call reduction, and I've grouped together 2 portions of this, both abilities that will diminish incoming damage, we call them usually DRs, and also abilities that produce some kind of a absorption effect on characters. And why have I put these two together? Well, both of these, damage reduction and absorbs, bypass the regular interactions that healers have with a health pool. Meaning, it doesn't matter if characters are at full health and your healing is in danger of overhealing, or if they're about to die. The reduction portions of your toolkits are always going to be effective. If it's a damage reduction, like say Power Word Barrier, or Pain Suppression, or Devotion Aura, or Sacrifice, if the person's at 10 health or full health, that damage reduction will always apply. It's always effective. The same thing is true for absorbs. Whenever an absorb is cast, say a simple example is Power Word Shield, that absorb will always be used up before the damage cuts into the health of your raiders. So it makes reduction effects actually really powerful. And we'll come back to talk about how when we're looking at meters, we should account for this fact that all reduction types, either the diminishing ones through damage reduction or absorptions, have a serious power level. It's an opportunity to significantly reduce the threat level of any major boss mechanic, or bypass many mechanics entirely through things like immunities. So you think about Bop, or Paladin's Self-Bubble, or Ice Block, these kinds of abilities. These are all forms of damage reduction. They don't give you any more health back, so if you're at 10 health, it's not going to help you survive the next hit once the damage reduction's gone, but it does provide a kind of proactive way to deal with things. So you have these two, recovery and then reduction, and finally we have what we might think of as a third sort of main toolkit that all healers possess something of. And this is called Triage. Triage is kind of our emergency healing. So I package into this anything that's an instant cast ability that can save or help somebody that requires no significant preparation to do so. Like your Swift Mends, or your Lay on Hands, or your Serenity, Word of Glory, or on the AoE side, your Revivals. These abilities, and there's more examples of them, of course, sometimes come to us in utilities, so we get Shout from Warriors that does a similar kind of effect. All of these are really useful because they provide some kind of immediate emergency help. The focus here on Triage is anything that's unpredictable in terms of damage or a dangerous mechanic, especially if some raider, stands in bad or makes a mistake. Having access to these triage skills can help to make sure that nobody wipes. Now there's kind of dangers for each of these three types. I mentioned in recovery, the main danger is that we can overlap and produce a lot of overhealing. On the damage reduction side, there's the danger that these things will expire without being useful. So you press Devo Aura at the wrong time and it does nothing, or barrier goes down and nobody's standing in it. Or Spirit Link Totem only hits 2 people and ends up, killing somebody by accident by bringing them really way too low. Triage also has dangers, and the main one is that you will run out of resources too quickly. So for healers, of course, largely that's mana. And whenever you're leaning on Triage, you're generally speaking going to be casting inefficient spells, or spells that have a resource associated with them. On the Paladin side, that's things like also Holy Power, so Word of Glory. And the problem is, if you get into the habit of panic healing with too many regrowths that aren't mana cost efficient, or Flash of Lights on a Paladin, or Flash Heal on a Priest, these are spells that are going to drain your mana pool way too fast. You want to move away from having too much attention into Triage if you can possibly do so. So aside from the sort of core abilities that all of your specs are going to be built around, there's also a kind of rotational element. And the rotational element are all the skills that support these high impact GCDs. By rotational, I mean kind of 2 things. Abilities that healers use when they're not addressing significant recovery, reduction, or triage needs, and spells that can be cast sort of indefinitely. They don't have a CD, things like Prayer of Healing, Holy Light, Soothing Mist, Chain Heal, and then on maybe a Disc Priest does power word shields and shadow mends, and a druid presses rejuvenation. These are all buttons that you can continually press if you wanted to, and they usually round out your kit by supporting these high impact buttons that you want to be pressing. One of the things I want to talk about here is that rotational spells offer us a kind of set of questions we want to be asking. We want to know what our comp is doing rotationally, and that prompts a few questions. What are the filler spells for our comp? So in my case, we have a Resto Druid, Mistweaver, Resto Shaman, and Holy Paladin. What are the buttons that I'm anticipating my healing core are going to be pressing on a regular basis to fill in these special moments? And that's like rejuvenations for our Druid, Vivifies or Essence Font for the Mistweaver, a lot of chain heals and supporting the healing rains from our Resto Shaman. And then if you're playing the Holy Light build, you would be filling with things like Holy Light on the Paladin. Other questions you want to ask: which of the healers in your comp can transition easiest to the triage side of healing? So if a massive amount of danger comes up or somebody makes a mistake, which of the people in your comp is best suited to immediately transition? So some questions you can be asking for your raid comp: are there people within your raid that are going to be consistently casting long cast time spells? Like if you're doing the Holy Light build for Holy Paladins, you would have a really long cast there, so something like 2.5 second baseline. If your Resto Shaman is in the group and they're casting a lot of chain heals, that's also a long cast time. These two setups for the Resto Shaman and for the Holy Paladin would not be ideal for trying to transition to immediately address some problem, even though some of their kits have some buttons to do that. If you're in the middle of a Holy Light cast, it's hard to switch gears and hit somebody with a really high impact spell. And then maybe another question: can the healers adjust their profiles with different kinds of fillers? Not the core abilities, because those are all going to stay the same. Every priest is going to have access to him. Every druid has access to tranquility. But is there ways to change the basic filler that a spec is doing? And that might be something you can adjust to help out your comp. So I think the best two examples in my mind are a Fist Weaver, so a Mistweaver monk who's doing melee healing. I'm not sure if that's even very viable, but it represents a different approach for the filler side. And also moving the Paladin away from Holy Light bombs and pushing them more towards the Glimmer style that we've seen in past expansions, so the melee Paladin. Those would offer sort of significantly different approaches on the filler side. So rotational spell breakdown, and you should always check your logs, will help you and your healer comp figure out how to optimize the healing. And it'll help you to also build some better habits so that your team doesn't spend a lot of time panic healing or triage healing when they don't need to. There will be probably somebody within your group that is best suited to transition from their regular filler spells to deal with triage needs, but you don't really want everybody jumping on their triage spells, spamming regrowth, spamming flash heals, spamming healing surges, whatever it is, to try to save people's lives. You want to try to manage how often you do that because it's a heavy resource sink. So now let's transition and talk a little bit about the damage profiles. And by damage profiles, I mean what kinds of predictable damage does an encounter have? What's the intake of that damage based on the mechanics of the fight, and perhaps a reasonable allowance for the failures that people might produce? There's a number of major damage profiles that we need to be aware of as healers, and we can adjust our healer comp to address them. Things like dots and burst damage, area damage, things that are shared between players, and anything that's maybe specifically positional. So I think line of sight on Shriekwing, people being linked up from other raids. If you have to get into a line to deal with a mechanic, that's also a positional requirement. All of these types, these 5 kind of major types of damage profiles, are going to put the healer comp at a disadvantage, and you need to figure out a way to overcome that. Now, some of it is just straightforward. Well, slap on this major CD here, assign this DR tool there. But also on the rotational side, you might need to be asking questions like, can my healers reasonably stand still and do their rotation? Or are they going to be constantly moving around and have to maybe adjust what they're doing? If it's heavy movement, maybe your Resto Druid will be the person you want to lean on for that throughput side, but your maybe your Shaman's going to struggle outside of Spirit Walker's Grace to get a lot done. Or maybe you need to just tune your raid to help your Shaman get to the right spaces so that they can continue to pump out chain heals and healing rains. These kinds of damage profiles help you as a raid team and as a healer comp assess what's going to work and what's going to be really difficult for you, and you can adjust your talents and all that kind of stuff to match it. This can also include covenants, legendaries, conduit adjustments, anything that you can do to help make individual play stronger. But some of these group adjustments can go a little bit deeper. You can start to think about the tools and the rotation, as I've been mentioning before, that are core to your character, and you can ask some questions that might be helpful. So you can ask, for example, maybe one of your healers to lean a little bit more towards either the triage side or the recovery side, and like not even worry about the other side. A good example, Holy Paladins using Holy Power only for Word of Glory and only in triage to deal with endangered members rather than casting Light of Dawn. That might be a setup that you can build, and we'll talk a little bit about what I've considered this triage setup a little bit later. You might mean, on the other hand, asking your Resto Druid to forget about, worrying about regrowths and just blanket the raid with hots. Maybe they're going to pick up germination and be double hotting and just double down on basic recovery and throughput. Could mean asking your Disc Priest to focus their ramps into the DR side, so damage reduction, instead of recovery. And they would do this by making use of the Spirit Shell talent, where they convert all of what would be atonement healing into shields, instead of maybe using evangelism, where they can double down on ramp and extend that duration. The usefulness of this, for example, for a Disc Priest doing this, is it might not be something that everybody in all of Warcraft is going to do, but it might work for your group and for your comp to ask your members or talk together about how they can craft a composition that's going to work. And that's the one thing I want to get across in this video today. People will tell you, here's how you play this class, here's the buttons you press, here's the order of them. But healing comps are not really like that. If you tend to do that, you will start to stress meters. And that's where we're going to turn to in our next discussion, is what is it about meters that makes people go crazy, and why do we need to maybe think about a different way forward? So there's kind of a dirty truth about healing meters, and it's that, you can be a huge HPS pumper, but the chances are, if you're just destroying the meters, you're probably hindering your raid by sniping a bunch of heals. What do we mean by heal sniping? Heal sniping means that either through your regular rotation or through your use of your tools, your big kit cooldowns, you are cutting into the healing that some other healer is providing. So you're overriding rejuvenations and making them all overheal when you press salvation and blast everyone's HP to full. Or you're topping people off who could take a little bit more damage and lean on the renewing mists that are going out. This kind of strategy is partly what unravels a lot of healer comps, because people start to resent the fact that you are not playing as a team. And the dirty truth is that healing meters live or die in the group setting. So you have to take all HPS meters and all the logs with a grain of salt. Unless there's some major discrepancy in the healing meters, they don't actually matter at all. If each player is doing their part, that's where the benefit is. So be careful about treating meters with too much respect. Also the second thing is that there's the benefit from some classes or skills or abilities are not actually that easy to represent on a meter. For example, saving someone's life with a life cocoon. Life cocoon will show up on the meters somewhere, and great, it's a nice absorb, but it doesn't really translate necessarily unless you look deeper into the logs at what that life cocoon did at that particular moment. So too also with reducing damage via devotion aura or barrier. If you do the math on having any paladin just with your 3% devotion aura running, it's worth a ton of healing, because everybody for the entire raid, while that paladin, whether it's Ret, prod or holy, well, while that paladin's alive, you are reducing all the damage that goes out to everybody in the area. It's just massive, but it doesn't really show up on the meters. Same thing with a well-placed barrier by a disc priest. Everybody standing in that barrier getting 25% DR, absolutely phenomenal. I think good raiders tend to know this, and so they will use it well, but I just want you, while you're building your healer comps, to think through the value of meters and how to evaluate things well, and what is actually a problem when people start talking about, oh, look at the throughput and this thing's amazing. To come back to the idea of damage reduction and absorbs, I just want to emphasize that they tend to be substantially more valuable than raw throughput. The first thing to say about it is that they are completely efficient, and I talked about this earlier in the video. That means that your DR will always be working the whole time it's on and will be reducing damage, and also a shield is completely used up before it cuts into the health of your raid members. They can be pre-planned and are therefore generally a proactive ability, which is excellent. You put a tool into someone's hand and you say, using this ahead of time will prevent a ton of damage. That's an excellent tool. Reactive tools sometimes get used poorly because somebody tops the raid off before you press your button, or while you're just doing your normal healing rotation, you might happen to select a raid member while another one of your healers does so. It happens a lot, and that's fine. But a proactive tool means that your shields are going out before the damage happens, and you're reducing a lot of it. It also, and this is perhaps the most significant part in my mind, it reduces what we would call as maybe the triage strain. So triage strain happens when everybody's about to die and healers feel really cramped in their GCD usage. And so they're spamming out emergency heals to try to bring the raid up, but it's kind of anxiety inducing. It's part of what makes healing fun, but also the constant emergency healing is kind of tough, both on healers and on raiders. The healers feel the strain of making every GCD choice perfectly correct or someone dies, and DPS and tanks lose uptime on the boss sometimes trying to save themselves. You know, they're potting, they're pressing their own personal CDs, they're kind of moving away from mobs or perhaps even kiting, trying to survive. This is not a great environment. So triage strain is a significant thing, and what you'd like to do as a raid is hope that you have a plan as a healer comp for who's going to sort of lean into triage healing when it comes up, who's going to continue to do their rotational work and not sweat it and not worry, and work out good communication that way. Now I'd like to transition and talk finally about this Triage Paladin setup for Shadowlands. And I think the H Paladin setup has some interesting things going for it as a go-to triage healer, meaning you would have, as in my case, Resto Druid, Mistweaver, Resto Shaman, all doing a lot of throughput healing and being geared towards that, which they're all excellent at. And then tacking on top of that healer comp a person who would devote themselves entirely to the emergency side, so dealing with triage. So we have sort of talents to consider, and I'll just kind of run through these, and then we'll talk a little bit about Shadowlands' borrowed power and what we can look forward to with Legendaries, Covenants, and Conduits. As far as the playstyle is concerned, the basic idea is this: we want to move towards entirely instant cast tools in our rotational approach, so we're not going to be casting Holy Lights or Flash of Lights. We're going to index away from that so that we can at any time be prepared to triage or spot heal a low member. All of our holy power is going to go into Word of Glory. Light of Dawn's a fine skill and you can plan for it and build into it, but this build would say, instead of that, I'm just going to make sure all of my Word of Glories bring somebody from the grave up to a reasonable amount. It also invokes the melee approach, so Shock and Crusader Strike with Crusader's Might bringing back all of your holy shock cooldowns, and then instead of filling with those cast spells, we're going to fill with Light of the Martyr because it's instant cast, it has good spell power coefficients, and we can do it on the move. It does do a little bit of damage to us, but there are some ways to reduce that through our own CDs. On top of this, we'll probably be babysitting the tanks just as a side job while we're triage healing. On the talent side, we're going to try to optimize our global cooldowns for holy power generation. We can, if we want, if the encounter demands it, lean into some of the big CDs like Avenging Crusader, Holy Avenger, or Virtue. So if there's a need for more recovery, then we can do that if we'd like. But we kind of generally want to say no to Bestow Faith because it's kind of bad for triage. It has a delay. It's a great ability, but on the triage side, it has a delay and it cramps our GCDs having to cast it every 12 seconds. Light's Hammer also we kind of want to say no to, partly because it has positional issues if people are not stacked, and it doesn't generate us any holy power, although it is a fairly good 1 minute CD if you're doing the ranged Holy Paladin build. We also want to say no to Prism for the same reason as Bestow Faith. It has a GCD cramp every 20 seconds, and it probably doesn't quite have the throughput you need, though if you cast it on your member, its spell power coefficient a little bit less than a Holy Shock, so it's not the worst. And if you cast it on the boss, you'll spread healing, which is fairly significant, and will go into your beacon targets. So if you prefer to do Holy Prism instead of Judgment of the Light, which I think is slightly better for raid healing overall, I would not say no to that. Holy Prism's okay, but again, it just every 20 seconds you kind of have to press it, which may be a problem if you're leaning into triage healing. We also want to say no to Seraphim, because it requires prep for us to use, and the goal of the triage side of Holy Paladin is just to make sure there's no prep needed to instantly turn and make sure somebody is okay. Glimmer presents an interesting problem, partly because of the Covenant we're going to aim for and the Legendary that we probably want to use, which incentivizes the use of Glimmer because we will get more value out of it. But the problem is that Glimmer, in terms of its playstyle, is going to disincentivize shocking targets who already have Glimmer. So if someone's about to die, they have Glimmer on them. Taking the Glimmer talent means that we're going to sort of, override a little bit of the use that we could get out of putting our shocks around in the old style of Glimmer from BFA. So I would recommend instead starting with Beacon of Faith and then seeing if your team needs the recovery from Beacon of Virtue use. Beacon of Virtue is going to be a bit more of a mana sink, but you can temper it around the main mechanics coming out of Castle Nathria and think a little bit about how to use it. As far as the borrowed power is concerned, coming out from Shadowlands, we have Legendaries to consider, and I think the main one that I'm going to focus on is Shock Barrier, partly because it got buffed, so we have 5 targets that we can hit now instead of 3. Shock Barrier is going to synergize fairly well with reducing the CD through Crusader's Might, and it also adds that additional reduction layer if we're thinking about the triad of recovery, reduction, and triage. It's going to add a little bit of a barrier, which is always helpful when we're trying to be a triage healer. On the Covenants, we're going to think about Kyrian probably above all the others if we're looking at triage. The reason for this is partly to do with the fact that Divine Toll generates 5 holy power for us immediately, so it doubles down. It also is an amazing ability at casting out 5 holy shocks on the raid and bringing everybody up, but it's going to double down and give us 5 holy power on top of that. So some of the other ones are okay, but they just don't offer kind of the burst healing power and synergy that Divine Toll offers a triage style of healer. And then on the Conduit side, we're going to lean into Light of the Martyr through Untempered Dedication. We're not going to take Murad, so we're not really worried about casting Light of Dawns and then buffing up our next use of Light of the Martyr. Instead, we just want to build up the baseline of this ability and scale it, because it has a 210% spell power coefficient that we can make use of, which is going to make it a premier triage skill once you stack it up to 5. It's not that hard to stack it up to 5. And with scaling, actually, I think Untempered Dedication is going to get completely out of control. We may actually have to end up stopping our scaling of this in the Conduits because we'll one-shot ourselves. But I think this is just an excellent triage ability. In order to keep up the buff from an Untempered, we just have to cast Light of the Martyr once every 15 seconds, which is completely reasonable in this build. Next, we want to pick up Shielding Words, in part because we're casting a ton of Word of Glories, and Word of Glory is going to give us our own little personal shield. Again, shields are just completely efficient and excellent as kind of a pseudo DR, and since we're going to be martyring ourselves a little bit, this will help to offset that. And then finally, we're going to pick up Ringing Clarity just to double down on toll. It helps us to triage that toll target even further. I think this Holy Paladin triage build has a lot of value if your raid comp includes, like mine, 3 other heavy throughput healers. And the reason I think it's useful is largely because you can help out your other healers to focus on their regular throughput duties, and they don't have to turn their attention to triaging with really inefficient skills. The Holy Paladin can say, hey, look guys, I have a lot of efficiency in Word of Glory, in Holy Shocks, and in Light of the Martyr. I can take up that role almost entirely and make sure that people don't die who are at 10%. You just pump out the throughput and make sure that you're bringing them up from that 50% marker all the way to the top. And you can lean on, Tranquility every 2 minutes if you want it. You can lean on Revival, and you can lean especially on Healing Tide, Totem, and Spirit Link to carry you through all of the mechanics, all the while allowing this Holy Paladin to just pump out both DR through, Aura Mastery and these lovely single target bombs. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I was trying to be a little more detailed in working out how you can think about your own healer comp. I know many of you will not have a paladin in your healing comp, and that's totally fine. You'll have disc priests, you'll have a different setup, but the point is to sort of work out what are these main 3 features, recovery, reduction, and triage, and how can you tune your talents to work as a team to help you progress through Castle Nathria. Thank you very much for watching, and if you enjoyed the video, please leave a like. We'll catch you next time.